Hi, I'm Jordan. In an interview with Larry King, you said, "These are the women who influenced the founding fathers, the women who influenced Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton and Madison and Washington. And when I thought about it, I really didn't know very much about them at all. Much of your work as a writer has been about sharing stories of people in history who are often not given a voice. Why do you believe this is such an important subject to explore? And what do you believe these stories can teach us today?"
Well, I think that the fact is that when I set about writing Founding Mothers, which came out in 2004, there was really nothing. It's improved a lot since then. There were a couple of good biographies of Abigail Adams, but that was about it. And, you can't leave half of the human race out of history. It's basically inaccurate history if you leave out half of the human race. And I thought it was terribly important to write about and educate people about the contributions of these women, but also just what they were thinking and doing in everyday life. You get a much, much fuller picture of American life through the letters of women. Women's letters are just so much better than men's letters because the men, particularly in the founding period, but in any period, the men were very self-conscious, very aware that they were doing something extraordinary, and that if they succeeded, that they would be held in high acclaim. If they failed, they'd be hanged, so it got your attention. But if they succeeded, they would be big deals, and they knew that. And so they wrote with that in mind. So they wrote carefully, often on a single subject. They edited, they were pompous, and they just weren't letters. They were treatises, whereas the women wrote letters. They didn't expect me to be reading their mail 200 years later, and they wrote about everything. They wrote about the economy. They wrote a lot about politics from their perspective, which was quite interesting. But they also wrote about the economy, and they wrote about who was having and all too often losing children, and they wrote about fashion. And so you learn a much, much bigger picture of American life through their letters than through the men's letters. They also are much franker and funnier. We see the founders as these bronze and marble statues. Their wives did not see them that way. And it's not, and I actually can make the case that strongly that it is not any denigration of these men to see them as human beings. In fact, it makes them far more admirable. It's easy for a deity to do something extraordinary. It's not so easy for a flesh and blood human. And they did something extraordinary. But they were flesh and blood humans, and their wives and friends and sisters and mothers certainly knew it. And some of the letters are just very extraordinarily frank and funny. So, well, let me just give you an example. So Verena Davis, who was Jefferson Davis's wife, Jefferson Davis was a horrible person, but she was really neat. She was this really interesting, smart woman. And she was furious when another woman in Washington, this is before the Civil War, shortly before the Civil War, a woman named Adele Cutts, who was Dolly Madison's great niece, married Stephen Douglas, the man who ran against Lincoln, you know the Lincoln-Douglas debates and all that, and won for the Senate. Stephen Douglas won. Verena Davis hated Stephen Douglas, and Adele Cutts was going to marry him, and she was furious. And she says, she writes a letter to her mother and says, this is a terrible situation. This drunken old man who's living off his first wife's money gets a beautiful, brilliant woman because she's poor and her father's proud. And then she says, and you would never read this in a man's letter, then she says, it's a good thing a new water system is being built in Washington, so Douglas may bathe a little oftener. Otherwise, he will offend his wife's olfactories, and we will all have to build bigger rooms with more perfect ventilation. Now, you don't read in men's letters that Stephen Douglas stinks, and And that's just a tiny, it's just a hysterically funny, but tiny example. It's on and on like that, where they just tell you things that you would never know otherwise, and they just crack you up.